the assistential kind of style tends to be fairly authoritarian, autocratic, tends to concentrate power, but tends to get things done. Like, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this, right? So, and then sociology is sometimes called instrumental leadership. A facilitative style of leadership tends to be much more participatory, consultative. What do you think we should do? Who should be involved in the conversation, make decisions, and so forth. This is sometimes called, let's see, what's instrumental, and I forget the other term right now, and I should know it, but in sociology it has a bigger term. We'll call it like non-instrumental leadership. Anyway, big fancy term, but it means basically participatory versus autocratic. Obviously one of the strengths of the participatory is that everybody gets involved in the decisions. You tend to make better decisions, maybe. But one of the problems with participatory is it usually takes a really long time. So if you have participatory styles of leadership in a context, it usually takes a really long time to get anything to be done. Whereas authoritarian leadership styles have potential for some negative consequences, perhaps, but they also tend to get things done rapidly. In general, when you're talking about relief situations, one of the sort of things that organizations tell each other is that it's okay to have assistential or authoritarian types of leadership in that context, because you need to get things done fast, right? There's for example, there's a disaster. You don't want everybody to sit around and say, so what do you think we should do, right? So we had to get things done. We should create structures that have these kinds of authoritarian leadership styles. It's okay. However, there's a lot of sort of critique in the literature about whether that is really true or whether that's really appropriate, for two reasons. One is they would say that if you have an authoritarian leadership style combined with an external transfer-oriented mentality, you can create or trample over sort of things that are happening in the field. You can be ignorant of the context because you're transferring in. You have authoritative style, so you're moving quickly. You're not necessarily getting a lot of viewpoints, so you could actually end up trampling a lot of stuff. So they said maybe it's okay to sometimes not seek to create authoritarian leadership styles in a let's say a post-disaster context. We'll call it post-conflict if you want, but post-disaster context, because there's a potential for trampling. But the other problem is that you've created the authoritarian leadership styles in these organizations, let's say that are working in this context. They're going to stay there. And so suddenly you've created a whole culture of authoritarian leadership style organizations in a context that may eventually move away from a post-disaster sort of milieu. And so therefore not be as appropriate for the long-term sustainable participatory style leadership that's required. So in the interest of getting things done and getting things done quickly, the development industry may espouse a certain style of leadership, which then the literature says may not actually be good in the long run. And the same thing happens in also political levels, although I'm obviously not I'm an expert in everything, but this would be one of the things I'm not as quite an expert on. But if you look for they're at least a strong leader, they can hold things together, so we'll keep funding them. That strong leader is not suddenly going to say, hey, today I'm going to be participatory. So if you're talking about long-term sustainability of a social system, you really are talking about decentralized power, whether you call it democracy, whether you call it something else. But you're really talking about decentralized decision-making processes where multiple stakeholders can be heard in the process. That is usually not the first approach of things that people are looking for in a post-disaster context. They usually say, well, as long as they're a strong leader, then they'll be okay. And so I would say I would just, again, puncture one of the myths of what organizations tell each other in the field about leadership. But I thought that, I really like that assistential versus facilitative framework for thinking about leadership of organizations and the way organizations function in a context and the way these organizations might work with these organizations. All of those things come into play. Short answer then is that it's probably better to take a little bit longer and be a little bit more facilitative, even in a post-disaster context, than to sort of flood the area with a whole bunch of sort of authoritarian leadership structure models, and then assume that they'll just sort of naturally dissipate when things move on, because that usually doesn't happen.